Good morning, good afternoon. We'll get things started with a poll as people start coming in. Apparently, I never turned this poll off because it's now been running 51 minutes. So thanks for starting to do it, and feel free to let us know who you're with and where you're from, and if you want to introduce yourself in the chat. That's always a nice way to get to know our neighbors. I'll give it 2 more minutes and then we'll get going here. All right, so it looks like we have quite a mix of people joining us today. Uh, Quite a few folks from Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba slept in. Well, thanks for joining us. Oh, and quite a mix of fire experience as well. So welcome to the first iteration of the Embers of Insight webinar series. Really excited to get this going with the Great Plains Fire Science Exchange. Over the last 3 years of the Canadian Prairies Prescribed Fire Exchange being an organization, we've had the opportunity to work with a lot of really experienced fire practitioners, and we've learned a lot along the way, and we're finally in a position to be able to share that with you. So thanks so much for joining us. Super excited that Rick could be our first speaker. Rick has just this year completed successfully his 50th season boots on the ground in fire operations. Maybe I should say he suffered through his 50th season. I don't know at that point, but there's so much to learn here, and I'll let Rick introduce himself once he gets started. But I wanted to start with a short story of when I met Rick, and there was a really forward-thinking ranch in Alberta that wanted to start using prescribed fire to take back some grazing acres, which is an issue that we're seeing more and more. And so we got the call that this ranch would be conducting some prescribed fire. So took the Canadian Prairies Prescribed Fire Exchange trailer, drove out there, met the crew. Rick was leading fire operations, but he saw it as a learning opportunity for me as well. And so put me on ignitions on the downwind side of this fire. Now, I do have a lot to learn still, but I would say that it's quite rare that I feel completely out of my element on a prescribed fire. The winds that day were out of maybe my comfort level, but Rick, with all his experience, was happy to keep things going and knew that we could contain it. The day was going along slow and steady, building some guard on that downwind side, and I reached the point where I was it was beyond my abilities. And so I radioed Rick. I said, Rick, if you want to take over, go ahead. Totally happy to let you do so. But as far as I'm concerned, the wind is, outside of my prescription comfort. And being the great leader that he is, slowed things down, broke it down. Okay, what exactly are you concerned about? Well, we've already been kind of challenged by this guard, and we're coming up on a big section of conifers. As soon as those things light up, they're going to shoot embers. We're going to lose this guard. I just don't think that there's any way in which we continue this safe. Fair enough. If you don't feel comfortable, we don't have to continue. But for the sake of conversation, are there any conifers in the area that are maybe not right on the guard that you could take a drip torch to and test it out? So, yeah, 20, 30 feet inside the fire perimeter, There were some isolated conifers. You could take some water, do it safely. I could not, to save my life, get those things to ignite. Not with all the diesel and all the fuel. And so, of course, report back into Rick. Turns out these things don't burn and won't burn and aren't an issue. And all we hear back is, yeah, at this humidity, conifers don't burn. I mean, we were sitting at 30-kilometer-an-hour winds. Anyways, that's just a taste of the insight and the experience that you're going to hear from today. Really happy to pass it over. Rick, thank you so much for joining us. And we will be recording this and putting it on our website later. Ladies and gentlemen, Rick Arthur.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone's well. I'm just going to share my screen here, but there's a poll quizzes thing here. Can I shrink it down?
Oh, please do.
All right, get that out of the way. Get this coming up. On my side of the fire, just in my defense, the winds were sitting about 15 clicks, 12 to 15. So I can understand now why Dinyar was a little concerned at his end, but he was on the upwind side, and we were burning in a pretty hard guard and feeling relatively secure. The issue was the conifer, and we just didn't have the indices at that point for the conifer to go, but certainly the grass burnt really well, exceptionally well. So yeah, Dinyar said 50 years, yeah, 50 consecutive years of feeding the ashes on wildfire, describe burns and all that. But for me, I guess it just shows that I'm a little bit of a slow learner. There we go. So I'm going to bring my presentation up here and we'll get right into it. There. Should be good. Can you see that?
Yes, we can. Looks good, Rick.
All right. So this presentation is targeting several different disciplines. We've got researchers, of course, that come from a variety of different disciplines, but focus really here is on people with a bit of a fire background and people who've got a bit of a grazing background. The issues are directly linked. You've got a lot in common. We've heard a lot about 2023 as being the worst fire season ever, so I've got to go off on a little bit of a tangent. I would suggest that it was the worst in recent history based on fire stats, but there's a lot of other sources that we have to look at. We have to look at some of the older journals, historic photos, oral tradition, lots of journals out there from our early pioneers, explorers, lots of tree rooting information out there, interviews, some of the older forestry inventory maps, aerial photography, and the rest. This image here is from Jody Axelson's thesis, historical streamflow variability in the South Saskatchewan River inferred from a network of tree ring chronologies. And what Jody managed to capture was basically through tree rings a lot of the wet and drought dry periods. So the orange areas you see are multi-decadal droughts going back in time. This first line is the 25th percentile, and that line drops us down to the 10th percentile. So those are, in my mind, representing very severe drought seasons. What we know, if we do a quick comparative analysis, we know that in Alberta here, the early 80s, pretty bad year, 3 years in a row, 4 years in a row. And it pretty much captures those. 1968 was a really big fire year. Late 1910s, the mid 1940s, we'll go through the dirty years and about a 25-year drought. 1909, 1910 was a little bit of a blip. You don't see it recorded here that well, but there is a dry year or two in there. 1840s to early 1880s, about 40 years, and we've got documentation from Palliser, Paul came, and a number of others. 1870s to early 1890s, roughly 40 years of predominantly drought. HBC and Fiddler, Peter Fiddler, and also record that info. The 1780s, early 1880s, 40 years of predominant drought, 1750s to 1910s, 10-year droughts. The 1600s overall look pretty normal, or average at least. And then when we get into the late 1400s, early 1600s, almost 100 years of, or 130 years of largely predominantly drought conditions. So if we think we've seen the worst, or this was the worst year, I think we can look ahead or look behind us so we can look ahead and say, no, we've still got a lot of bad times to come. And our climate does vary considerably. Some notes from journals. The Edmonton House, on April 27th, a large fire burned all around us and burned on both sides of the river. Early spring fire season, snow goes early. May 7th, light canoes arrived from Buckingham House, and they were damaged in the shallow water. The timber that was used in Edmonton House couldn't be sent to the post for want of water. And furs could not be moved because there was no water in the river. For those of you who are familiar with the North Saskatchewan, I grew up in the Edmonton area and then periodically visit back. I've never seen that river so low that you cannot canoe on it. Not sure if anyone else can speak to that. 1909, like you said, 1910 was just a little bit of a blip on that graph, but 1909 was the last of the Great Prairie Fires, starting in early October in around present-day Hannah. Winds drove it west towards Kimberley, Saskatchewan, and north towards East Edmonton, about that Highway 1314 range. Burned roughly 14.5 million acres in 3 days. In 1910, roughly 1 million acres burned along the foothills in southern Alberta and vast areas along the Athabasca River further north. Just going back here, this photo here is from Wheeler, 1895, on one of his stations in the Pequesco Creek area. 1895 is before 1910, and it did burn in 1910, this area. And that's what it looks like today, or at least in a few years ago. This is 1895 again, Wheeler. The Knob was the name of the station. There was a forest reserve boundary survey in 1910, and Edgecombe, who was the forester that was looking after that particular area, said that repeated fires have devastated the eastern slopes, and the forest type consequently was altered and areas eroded. He estimated 60% of the forest reserve had been fire swept in the 60 years since 1850. And you can see all kinds of evidence of different fire patterns here. So we're in the upper foothills, sub-eco region. That's the Elbow River, the upper end of the Elbow River, and you can see the fairly significant disturbance down in the gravel bars at the bottom from recent floods at that time. The oldest known stand that were of a stand origin of anything in the Elbow watershed that we're aware of right now is about 1685. That's 2007. And then we went back again after the significant flooding in 2014. And you can see the gravel bars and everything are heavily damaged. This type of disturbance becomes very evident on the repeat imagery when you have long periods of in between major flood events, but the flood events often look very similar. Getting a little closer home, this black boundary and the white boundary is the OH, or the OH Ranch Heritage Rangeland. And then the black boundary, which does go up in around the top of the white, is the Tongue Creek Ranch. This area is characterized by two different sub-ecoregions, the Foothills Parkland and the Montane. When they were created, or when these sub-ecoregions were developed, they really looked at elevation and latitude as drivers, but the frequency of disturbance history was not brought into the creation of these. When you start looking at the sub-ecoregions closely, you can really see that they've got a significant difference in those sub-ecoregions and the disturbance patterns. Let's go on to the next slide here, which I don't have information for fire regime for the Foothills Parkland, but for the Montane, Cliff White's research looked at 7 years at the bottom of the Bow Corridor. The goes to the north of there by MP Rougeau and all the rest of these, 30 years, 30 to 70 years, 27 years, 16 to 22, and 9 to 31. You get the drift. In Brad Hawk's work on his fire appraisal of Kananaskis Provincial Park, or now Peter Lougheed Provincial Park, he recorded, I think it was 19 different major fire events from the up to 1920s, about 1920, but there hasn't been another major fire event since then. The fire return interval at that point for large fire events was about 11 years. Significant changes in these ecosystems. So in our society, we always put our hands on our hearts when we talk about natural and Mother Nature, and the question is, what is natural? We know that grasslands and forest ecosystems have coexisted together for millennia, but they're not necessarily compatible. If you leave these areas without disturbance, forests take over. Indigenous people recognize that. They used fire constantly to maintain and renew the grasslands and those younger seral stages of forest. Without frequent disturbance, grasslands become impacted by woody plant expansion, or WPE, and they will transition to permanent forest cover. We're seeing that hugely across the Montane and any of those higher reaches, but also within the Foothills Parkland. So encroachment, it's defined as that act of slowly covering more and more of an area. And we really need to recognize that these landscapes that we see today are not what existed historically and will not be sustainable for tomorrow. A few more examples. And what I'm going to do is try to do a little bit of crossover between looking at the forest fuels and the density that they have, as well as looking at some of the changes on rangelands or outside of the historic and traditional forest reserve areas or forest protection areas here in Alberta. So Wheeler in 1914 took the shot of Castle Mountain. This is in the South Castle Valley. The station was called Castle West. When you zoom in, and they're really high resolution images, when you zoom in on these, you can't see a whole lot of black sticks on those slopes. There's virtually any, and that's a good indicator that we have frequent fire burning there, keeping the trees small and renewing them. You do start to see a little bit of growth coming up on them. You can see some regen coming in. This area did not burn in 1910. And the Indigenous burning had stopped about 40 years prior to. In 2005, we went back and took this photo. The South Castle Valley had burnt in 1932, exceeded in lodgepole pine right across, and you can see those slopes have filled in But in 2002, there was a very late heavy snowstorm, late spring snowstorm in early June. It caused extensive damage. And when you zoom in, you can see a lot of that. And this goes across entire valleys. We also have areas where there's extensive wind damage now, going as far north of the Edson area all the way right down to south of Calgary and the foothills. That fuel loading is phenomenal when you start looking at its flammability. If you think of the Keno fire in 2017, extensive beetle damage, probably snow damage in there, years of buildup, and then a fire under very severe indices. This is kind of into the wildland urban interface. This is Bragg Creek in 1926. I found some aerial photos that had been taken, vertical aerial photographs taken by the National Air Board or the Canadian Air Board, the beginnings of they eventually became the Canadian Air Force. But they were using World War I vintage aircraft and trying to determine if there was a civilian use for aircraft. And they took these photos that I made into a bit of a panel. And that's Bragg Creek today. So considerable amount of development, lots of fuel loading, and a significant change from the fuel loading that we saw in the past. Outside of the forest reserve, this is the Pritis area south of Calgary. And it's evolved considerably today. So we can really say that encroachment is pretty much everywhere on our landscapes. This photo here is out on the Tongue Creek Ranch, and it's an excellent example of what we should be looking at as professionals ourselves. When we look across these landscapes, you see young aspen coming up through here. I'm going to say 30, 35 years ago, most of that aspen was not there. The young spruce that's coming up and in amongst the willow, that's also established in the last few years and certainly wasn't there. So most of this image here would have been predominantly open grasslands at that point. And I did find some evidence of in other images that would validate that. So if you're taking a drive sometime, have a look around you and look for all that young conifer coming up amongst the willows, and you know it's converting over from willow or aspen into that latter stage conifer growth. The white spruce that we have across our landscapes and the way it spreads is very similar to the cedar in the southern ends of the Great Plains and the problems they're experiencing with WPE. This is on the Tongue Creek Ranch again. I just took a small sample here. That's about a mile. That black vertical line is 1 mile. It's part of a grazing lease. 1926. What we see is a couple small clumps of aspen starting to come up. We see the very light gray is some willow reestablishing itself. And again, this is probably hadn't burned by Indigenous burning for at least 50 years at that point. Maybe a little bit less, but in that range. There had been major fire events that we have some documentation on: 1863, 1896, 1910, 1919. All of them just come up just to the edge of the forest reserve, and then we don't have the data on the east side, and this is on the east side. So there's a possibility some of this may have burnt in at least one of those fire events. When you look into these photos really closely, and they're pretty good resolution, again, there's no evidence of black sticks in there, and that's a good indicator that you have a longer fire return interval. 1944, you can see those two ponds that were in there. One is the one that was lower one was pretty well dried up, and the other one's almost dry. The deciduous stands have really started to grow and expand in area. The white spruce is starting to dominate over on the in that northeast corner, that major stand right through the center of that vertical black line. And again, the effects of that multi-decadal drought, very, very clear there. Next image, 1958. Deciduous stands again are aging and still expanding. White spruce is well established. The poplar and now the willow is starting to act as nurse crops. You see the willow is really densified on the lower part of this image, and you can see some tiny black specks in there, and that's the spruce that is starting to establish itself and is dominating over the willow at that point. 1982, there's been a little bit of range improvement work done down in the bottom corner, and you can see where they've cleared areas, but for some reason they cleared the willow, but they left the spruce. In the upper corner, on the east side, spruce is now pretty dominant on that one part of the stand, and you can start see across the northern stands, spruce starting to co-dominate through the aspen. The water table has come back up, and those ponds are back full again. By 2022, some harvesting has occurred on that stand up on the east side. The rest of it, the spruce is starting to dominate or co-dominate at the very least. Without ongoing maintenance, the areas that were done through range improvement, basically clearing and piling the willow, have been lost. And the spruce that was left behind acts as a seed source and really helps to spread in those areas that were slightly disturbed. You got any questions at this point? Okay, I'm just going to run through this part quickly. What I did on the Tongue Creek Ranch is I created a map looking at the existing vegetation cover and a very coarse inventory of mature deciduous coniferous, willow, pure coniferous, pure deciduous, brush, grasslands, and healthy range. But I also looked and interpolated and looked back at what potentially the historic vegetation cover would have looked like. And for the titled lands, the NCC, we're looking at least 75% of those lands being healthy grass back at the turn of the last century or in the 1870s. And it represents some very significant range loss over time. So some of the impacts of woody plant encroachment, as I said earlier, it's expanding at a rate of 1 to 2% annually across North America. This is a problem around the world. 25% of the rangelands in the Western US have sustained forest cover expansion, and they've lost an estimated value of $5 billion since 1990. The forage lost annually is estimated to be the equal of consumption of 1.9 million cattle, and many cattle are becoming unsustainable. The Tongue Creek Ranch, on the grazing lease lands, they've just been cut back another 9 to 10% for their annual allowable, animal unit months that they're allowed to graze on those areas, and that's significant. For biodiversity in Alberta, 80% of the species at risk are in grasslands. And I would argue that many species adapted to the frequent use of anthropogenic fire over thousands of years, and many of those species are now impacted by habitat loss, largely due to WPE and largely from fire exclusion. If you think of something simple as sharp-tailed grouse in Blackfoot language, one of their words for them would describe them as fire chickens. Chickens wild or otherwise, like to peck and scratch for seeds and insects. If you have a heavy grass mat, you don't have good habitat anymore. And so we see our sharp-tailed grouse, which across the Western North America used to be in a very abundant species, for the most part now is threatened. Hydrological impacts are significant. Reducing groundwater discharge. Shrubs and trees use more water than grasses. Even with increased stream flow or increased in precipitation levels, there have been decreased levels in stream flow linked right to woody plant expansion. 20% increase of shrub growth outside riparian zones results in a 25% loss of through transpiration rates. And then surface moil and subsurface moil is being impacted as well. Carbon sequestration, a big issue these days. Grasslands store a significant amount of soil carbon. And they believe that the above or below ground carbon storage is twice that of above ground woody plant. There's a lot of research needed in this area. How to manage woody PE, you have to understand it if you're going to manage it. And there's 5 stages based on research that was done through the University of Oklahoma. If you're going to treat it, start right and maintain your existing grasslands and keep them intact. You get to the dispersal stage where plants start to move through, then move on to recruitment, where they start becoming well-established. Encroachment, they're pushing and seeding in on their own at this point, and then transition brings us right to a forested stage. The earlier you can treat an area, the cheaper it's going to cost you. There's no easy answers. There's no quick fixes. There's no one-shot treatments, and it's not an easy road to go down. But if we don't do this, we are going to lose significantly in plant production and grassland production, food production. You said no silver bullets, so it's a matter of combining treatments and monitoring and continuing to try different things at different times to try to get things to work. Lots of pros and cons. The heritage rangeland is a natural area designation in Alberta that was focused on protecting the grasslands and maintaining them. And the concept they had when they developed the management plan was that it could be done through good grazing. That only works to a certain point, but once the woody plant encroachment starts to establish, cattle and livestock cannot keep up. You can go on to mechanical treatments. The younger material, you can go in and mow it in the early stages. It's can be followed up with perhaps some herbicide treatments and make it more effective. If you don't keep up with it, the WPE becomes too large for mowing. You lose out. Pile and burning, again, traditional effective tool. Can be done off season or during the grazing season. Herbicide applications can be effective post clearing. If you disturb the soil at all, you're going to see noxious plants or invasive plants coming in. And if it's done during the dormant periods, there will be more sprouting of the woody plant material. Root systems aren't intact or disturbed. Mulching, become very common, mulching or massification. You basically grind, chip, or break apart any brush, small trees and slash into small pieces. It works well on fence lines and lighter brush. The equipment is specialized. It's readily available. Costs are comparable. If you have a lot of woody material, it will leave a layer of chips which may inhibit or reduce grass growth. And some equipment leaves larger pieces, which takes longer periods to dispose. And another concern I have is that under more severe fire danger indices, those wood chips lying on the ground become available to burn, but at least it's not a crown fire at that point. Herbicides, again, very, very commonly available, often used. They're really effective for spot treatment on noxious weeds. They really help when you use them in conjunction with other treatments, sort of a 1-2 punch. But costs have gone way up in the recent years, 400 or 500% for some of the different herbicides, and it can impact valuable forests and may decrease biodiversity if you don't use it judiciously. Timber harvesting. There's no question on the Tongue Creek Ranch. There's large areas that have fully turned over to conifer, and they're starting to use timber harvesting. It's a long process for approvals. If it's not done carefully, you can have some ground disturbance to introduce noxious species. You do require roads for hauling. Timber harvesting has got negative connotations in some circles. But in that heavy conifer, you've got very limited alternatives for restoring forest cover to a younger age class. There's only one way I can see to remove it, and that's through timber harvesting, unless you go to a high intensity and likely high severity prescribed burn or wildfire. I don't think anyone really wants to go that route. Using fire, various options exist: pile and burn, prescribed fire, biochar. Pile and burning can be done in most seasons. There's less risk, higher comfort levels. If dirt's mixed into the piles, there's holdover potential. You can sterilize the soil underneath. And biochar is something relatively new. It's a residue made up largely of carbon and ashes, and it's a result of burning woody material in an oxygen-limited environment. So there are biochar kilns as an example, and you could load your woody debris into those, and there is quite a market for biochar. Prescribed fire. Yeah, there's grassland ecosystems have adapted to low severity fire over thousands of years. The plants of native plant species respond positively. You can reduce densities. You consume seeds of woody plants before they germinate. It adds nutrients back into soil. It effectively reduces grass mat buildup, and almost immediately you have a positive ecological response. You need a sufficient grass load, meaning that ranch operations need to adapt to leave grass behind. Additional burns for maintenance are required. An elder I heard speaking the other day was saying, if you want to maintain an area in grass, you need to burn it every 2 years. If you want to keep it in light brush, every 4 years. A real concern I've got is that it takes time to build capacity. It can reduce costs as you get that capacity. It's weather dependent, carries lots of its own risks, and a lot of people are really frightened of fire. On the operations we've been conducting, safety is our first and foremost concern. Low severity fire is what we're trying to achieve. We create prescriptions specific to the fuels, the terrain, and the objectives. And the weather and fuel conditions must fall within the prescription. And we've got to have adequate resources on site to contain the fire. Everyone's got to know the burn plan. We want to stay within the prescriptions. We start slowly. We burn in by burning in and expanding guards based on conditions. And then once the perimeters are secure, you can start burning wider and larger areas. And you can use ignition patterns to control intensities. Just an example of a prescription 100% cured grass, assuming 3 tons per hectare. Usually you can get that, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less. Flat to gently rolling terrain, max temperature of 20 degrees, minimum RH 15%. And winds about 15 an hour. Fire intensities will determine if you can burn safely and security. You may find that fuels are responding differently than what you're seeing for fire danger indices. Part of it could be related to the time you're burning aspect, just the amount of heating and drying that has occurred on that particular slope. Once you have a good wide secured guard, you may have increased winds. You might be able to burn in those winds if your guard is secure and you don't have ember carrying fuels. But you have to judge each of those at that point. I like to develop a go-no decision matrix for outputs and inputs going in. And that just gives you some examples of go and no-go situations. Smoke management, big issue here for Foothills. They constantly get complaints about smoke from people burning in the winter. So you look for wind speed, mixing height, good fuel loads, fuel conditions, nice and dry. All those general, but smoke management is a real issue in any prescribed burn planning today. Some take homes, I guess. If we want healthy, vibrant ecosystems, we have to understand the historic disturbance patterns that created them. And we have to use every tool available for restoration. And we need to be creative and perhaps create some more. We need to develop that expertise and capacity. No one agency can do it alone. I think it really is important that various agencies, community groups, people start working together a lot more. And there is definitely a need to reassess policies or assess policies that are now in place, and they may have been inadvertently become a deterrent to actually meeting restoration or maintenance goals. Sometimes it becomes bureaucracy, sometimes it's this is the way we've always done things, and we're not willing to change, and we have to start changing because we're losing out right now. We have far more trees on landscape than we have ever had before. I said earlier, Foothills grasslands are being lost at a rate of 1 to 1.5% a year, and that's probably conservative. Our forests much older, much thicker, much more continuous, and they're much more flammable to age and damage. In 2003, we had the Lost Creek fire in the just south of Blairmore and Coleman in the Crow's Nest Pass. Very severe fire. You could actually do a very quick and dirty fire behavior prediction on that fire based on age class maps. Those fuels that burned or did not burn in 1910, which was when most of it had burned in that area, those fuels were far more flammable and much more responsive. Once the relative humidity got below 10%, all bets were off and everything would burn. Because of the amount of fuels on our landscapes, emergency response agencies are easily overwhelmed. It doesn't matter how many King's horses and how many King's men you have, you're not going to be able to manage it. And for the future, for insurance in the wildland urban interface, it's getting to be harder and harder to get. And in some areas in California, it's almost impossible now. So that's Hannah. Hannah came out on some of our prescribed burns, and you know, you can put a notebook in someone's hands or a backpack spray on them or a drip torch in their hands, but I guarantee you'll get a bigger smile with a drip torch in someone's hands than you will with a backpack sprayer. Okay, open for questions.
Hey, thank you so much, Rick. That was great. Lori from the Great Plains Fire Science Exchange is going to be monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in there. And Rick, I might try and get things started just by asking you. You helped bring fire back to an area that not only has been in a fire deficit, but is, you know, by and large, fire adverse, at least for a very long time. And you've been part of bringing a lot of acceptance back. We've done workshops since those first fires. There's a lot more landowner buy-in. I was wondering if you can speak to some of the early hurdles to reintroducing fire to an area where you're kind of getting that adversity, and then how you overcame some of those hurdles.
I don't know if we've ever overcome them yet. I think the hurdles are continuously there. We've had municipal staff involved with our fires, and actually during ignition and when burning was going on, so they could observe what we were doing. We ensured we had adequate resources. We have open houses ahead of the game to inform people of what we're doing. Perhaps we need to do more of those. We're now have a call-in line, so if you've got concerns, you can register and we will inform you of any burning that's going to be going on. We've got a program now where we're advising council members as well of some of our plans. Part of the issue for us is we're slightly above the communities the community of Diamond Valley, Black Diamond and Turner Valley, just to the north of us. So anytime a smoke lights up, they see this big smoke, and then the 911 lines light up. So we're on their Facebook chat pages as well, informing of any burning we're going to be doing. But invariably, you've got people coming in and they'll say, you're going to burn up the whole country. And we keep trying to ensure that we are containing the fires really well. And as we progress more, perhaps we'll get more satisfaction. But people are frightened of fire. And at the same time, it's a necessity. There's an old saying that fire is a wonderful servant, but it's a terrible master. And we cannot afford to lose a prescribed burn.
No, I agree, especially at these early stages of trying to build up capacity again. But, as much as you've had people speak out against the work you're doing, I know firsthand that a lot of the neighbors there have been asking how they can get involved and how they can actually start applying prescribed fire. So what do you see as the future of prescribed fire in that area, and how can capacity continue to increase, with the exception of you just leading a lot more burning out there?
I think it's just more exposure to burning and getting involved in burns. Like if there's some proposed burns in your community, or you're doing the burns, invite people to come on out and participate as volunteers, as observers. Get their feet in the ash and help them to understand not only the amount of preparation that's going into these burns, the equipment you've got on site, but also the care in what you're trying to achieve. It's not just burning more acres. It's a goal. In this case here, you can see the shrubby cinquefoil, and we were really trying to set that back. So we had some pretty good success, and we need a couple more burns on that site. We're in behind Hannah there to probably really knock it back.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Lori, I don't know if there was anything in the chats that you could add.
Nope. No, just no questions, I guess. One just came in. I joined late to this seminar, but I wanted to know how you are doing these burns. Are you utilizing a PBA in your area, or what kind of organization are you using? So that was just came in, and then some other questions like great job comments, and so yeah.
Okay, so for us on the Tongue Creek Ranch, this is prescribed burning on private land. It's sponsored privately and being conducted as a trial to see if it's going to give the results that the ranch owners want to see. We've got no government funding. We've got no government equipment. We borrowed some equipment from the Canadian Prairies Prescribed Burn Exchange, and we really, really appreciate that, as well as the experience that Dinyar and others can bring to us, and the more we burn together, the more we learn. Still expanding and trying to broaden that experience base.
And also you hired some local First Nations groups to come out as type 2s, correct?
That's right. We've hired boat fire crews again, some of the First Nations people have experience in fire crews, some do not, but are interested. So in part, I really like to get First Nations people out with us. I've done a lot of research on historic Indigenous burning and second order fire effects, what they were achieving, and my belief is that 500 years ago, the First Nations had a far better understanding of second order fire effects than we have today, bar none. But if you haven't been using fire, although it's been in for generations and thousands of years being used on that landscape, if you personally have not been using it, you still have to redevelop that skill set.
Nice one. Well, thank you so much, Rick. That was a great lunch hour chat. I'm going to reshare the poll because I think a bunch of people came in late and just want to know where everyone's coming from and what their experience levels are. Rick, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you sharing. That's an incredible amount of research that you put into this presentation. We do have it recorded, and we'll be sharing this presentation on our website, and I know Lori will be doing the same. And just wanted to remind everyone that we're going to have another webinar on Tuesday, March 5th. Brad Elder from the States, an incredibly experienced fire practitioner who unfortunately had a burnover incident a couple years ago. And so he's going to be talking about his perspective, what happened, what saved him, and what could have been different. So we encourage you to register for that. It's on our Facebook page, our website, and we'll be sharing it as well via email. So thanks everyone for joining. We'll stop sharing the poll or stop collecting the poll. And Lori, your question of did more Americans show up? Maybe they did, but they didn't click on the poll.
Darn. I thought I recognized some familiar faces, names.
Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your lunch hour, and we'll see you next time.